4:57 a.m., Japan was asleep and completely unprepared for what was already in the air. A single missile tore through the darkness, a Hwasong 12 moving faster than anything civilians could even comprehend, straight over one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. No warning, no explanation, just sirens, panic, and millions of people suddenly told to take cover. For a few terrifying minutes, no one knew what this really was. A test? A mistake? Or something much worse? But here's what most people didn't realize. While Japan was scrambling to react, the United States wasn't reacting at all. Because out in the Pacific, the USS Ronald Reagan was already moving, already positioned, already prepared. And what happened next wasn't just a response. It was a message so overwhelming that an entire country went silent for months. And the real reason why was far more calculated than anyone expected.
The launch that shouldn't have happened. Just hours before the world even realized what was coming, something unusual was already unfolding inside North Korea. Satellite systems picked up movement in the middle of the night. Not the routine kind analysts were used to seeing. This was different. Fuel trucks were being moved into position. Launch crews were assembling faster than normal. And at the center of it all stood a missile that immediately raised alarms. The Hwasong 12. This wasn't one of their smaller test rockets. This was a weapon designed for distance, for impact, for attention. And then came the detail that made intelligence officers pause. The direction. It wasn't angled toward empty ocean like previous launches. It wasn't following the usual safe test trajectory. It was pointed east, directly toward Japan. At first, analysts thought it might be another bluff, a calculated show of aggression meant to grab headlines without crossing a real line. North Korea had done that before, pushed just far enough to create fear, but not far enough to trigger a serious response. But this time, something felt off. The preparation was faster, the timing was tighter, and the positioning, it didn't leave much room for error. Then, without warning, the launch happened. A column of fire lit up the night sky as the missile blasted off, climbing rapidly, cutting through the atmosphere at extreme speed. Within seconds, global tracking systems locked onto it, calculating its path in real time. And that's when everything changed. Because the data coming in didn't match expectations. This wasn't a near miss. This wasn't a warning shot into the sea. The missile was going directly over Japan. Over cities. Over civilians. Over millions of people who had no idea they were about to become part of a global standoff. And in that moment, what was supposed to be a test suddenly became something much more dangerous.
The moment everything changed. As the missile climbed higher, cutting through the upper atmosphere, defense systems across the region began doing what they were built for: calculating, predicting, preparing. But within seconds, something didn't add up. The trajectory was wrong. Inside command centers in both Tokyo and Washington, analysts stared at the incoming data, watching the path update in real time. At first, there was hesitation. Maybe it would curve out toward the ocean like before. But it didn't. It kept going, straight over Japan. That's when the tone shifted instantly. Emergency alerts exploded across the country. Phones lit up. Sirens began echoing through cities still half asleep. Trains halted mid-route. Highways froze. Entire districts were told to take cover immediately. No explanations. No details. Just one message: ballistic missile threat. For millions of civilians, those few minutes felt endless. People rushed underground,
crowded into shelters, unsure if what was coming next would change everything. And yet, behind the scenes, the real shock wasn't just the danger. It was the realization of what this meant. This wasn't a misfire. This wasn't a technical error. This was intentional. North Korea had just crossed a line that had been carefully avoided for years, sending a missile directly over populated Allied territory. And in that moment, the situation stopped being a test and became a direct challenge. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Because while Japan was reacting in real time, the United States wasn't scrambling the way you'd expect. There was no confusion, no delay. In fact, key military assets were already in motion. Which raised a question that few people asked at the time. Was this response actually a reaction? Or had it already begun before the missile even launched?
The response was already in motion. While alarms echoed across Japan and officials scrambled for answers, something far more controlled was unfolding out in the Pacific. Roughly 200 miles away, the USS Ronald Reagan wasn't rushing into position. It was already there, already moving with purpose, already aligned in a way that didn't feel like coincidence. Because in the hours leading up to the launch, US surveillance had been watching every move inside North Korea. Satellite feeds, signal intercepts, patterns of activity that didn't match routine testing behavior. This wasn't a surprise. It was anticipated. And that changes everything. Instead of reacting after the missile crossed Japan, the US had quietly begun positioning its forces ahead of time, placing one of the most powerful naval assets in the world exactly where it needed to be. Not for defense, but for something else. For messaging. Inside the carrier, preparations had already started. Pilots briefed, aircraft armed, flight decks cleared. Every movement precise, controlled, and fast. No panic, no confusion, just execution. Because this wasn't about stopping one missile. It was about what came after. Back in Washington, the orders were clear and unusually direct. Don't escalate into war, but don't hold back either. Show them everything. And within minutes, that plan began to unfold. Jets were being prepared for launch. Coordination with Japanese and South Korean forces was already underway. Timelines were being compressed into a single, decisive window. This wasn't going to be a symbolic response. This was going to be overwhelming. But what made it even more unsettling was how fast it all came together. Almost as if the entire operation had been waiting for a trigger. And North Korea had just pulled it. But the real shock wasn't the speed. It was the scale of what the US was about to reveal next.
72 aircraft, but that wasn't the real threat. At exactly 6 a.m., the calm over the Pacific shattered. One after another, fighter jets launched from the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, engines screaming as they cut through the morning sky. Within minutes, the airspace filled with movement, fast, coordinated, and impossible to ignore. Then, more aircraft joined. Advanced stealth fighters from Japan, additional jets from South Korea. Within a short window, the number climbed rapidly. 20, 40, then over 70 combat aircraft moving in formation. 72. The largest aerial buildup in the region in decades. And every single one of them heading in the same direction. North Korea. From a distance, it looked like the beginning of something far more serious. Radar systems inside North Korea would have lit up instantly, tracking dozens of incoming aircraft closing in with precision. But here's what made it unsettling. They didn't cross the line. The formation stopped just outside North Korean airspace, close enough to strike within minutes, but holding position with deliberate restraint. It wasn't an attack, it was a demonstration. A perfectly calculated show of force designed to say one thing without firing a single shot. We're already here, and you can't stop us. But as intimidating as 72 aircraft looked, that wasn't what truly changed the situation. Because everything visible in the sky was only part of the message. The real threat was something North Korea couldn't fully see. Something that didn't need to fly overhead to be devastating. And within minutes, it would reveal itself in a way that no one in Pyongyang could ignore.
The move that terrified Pyongyang. As the 72 aircraft held their position in the sky, something else was unfolding below the surface. Silent, invisible, already in place. For hours, it had been moving undetected through the waters off North Korea's coast. No radar could track it. No warning system could predict it. And then, without rushing, without hiding anymore, it surfaced. The USS Michigan, a submarine designed for one purpose: overwhelming strike capability. But this wasn't a stealth move. This was intentional. It didn't stay hidden. It didn't disappear back beneath the waves. It surfaced just far enough, just long enough, to be seen. From the coastline, from military observers, from anyone watching closely enough. And that's what made it different. Because a submarine like this doesn't need to be visible. The moment it chooses to be seen, it's sending a message. A message that doesn't need words. Inside that submarine were over 100 cruise missiles, each capable of striking precise targets deep inside North Korea within minutes. Command centers, missile sites, critical infrastructure. All of it already within reach. And unlike the jets in the sky, this threat didn't need to cross any airspace. It was already positioned exactly where it needed to be. That's the moment everything shifted. Because now, it wasn't just about what North Korea could see approaching from above. It was about what they suddenly realized had been there all along. Waiting. And that realization changes the equation completely. Because when you understand that your opponent isn't just stronger, but already in position, already locked.
The silence that followed. Then, everything went quiet. Not gradually, not slowly, instantly. Monitoring stations that had been flooded with North Korean military signals just minutes earlier suddenly picked up nothing. No chatter between units. No radar sweeps adjusting to the incoming aircraft. No signs of escalation. Just silence. For analysts watching in real time, that was the most unexpected part of all. Because this wasn't normal. In moments like this, you expect movement. You expect reaction. Even a show of defiance. But instead, Pyongyang pulled back. Radar systems powered down. Communications dropped to near zero. Air defenses that had been tracking the 72 aircraft simply stopped responding. It wasn't a technical failure. It was a decision. And that decision revealed something far more important than any missile launch. North Korea wasn't preparing to fight. They were avoiding it. Because by this point, the full picture had become impossible to ignore. Above them, a massive air formation holding position just outside their reach. Along their coastline, strategic bombers demonstrating precision strike capability. And beneath the surface, the USS Michigan, already in range, already capable of launching a devastating response within minutes. This wasn't escalation. This was containment through pressure. Every angle covered, every option blocked. And for the first time in this entire situation, North Korea had no move left that didn't lead to something far worse. So they chose the only option that made sense. They went silent. No retaliation. No follow-up launch. No attempt to push further. Just silence. But that silence wasn't weakness. It was recognition. Recognition that the situation had shifted beyond their control. And that the message being sent wasn't just about one missile. It was about what would happen if they ever tried it again. But the real impact of this moment wasn't just what North Korea did. It was what the rest of the world saw and understood from it.
What this really revealed. What happened that morning wasn't just a missile test, and it wasn't just a military response. It exposed something much deeper. Because on the surface, North Korea had tried to show strength, launching a Hwasong-12 over Japan, sending a clear signal that they could reach targets far beyond their borders. But the reaction they triggered told a completely different story. Within hours, the United States and its allies coordinated a response so fast, so precise, and so overwhelming that it shifted the balance instantly. And that's the key point most people missed. This wasn't about one missile versus 72 aircraft. It was about capability versus reality. North Korea relies heavily on perception, creating the image of unpredictability, danger, and escalation. Because in a direct, prolonged conflict, they're at a serious disadvantage. Their conventional military power doesn't match the scale or technology of the forces surrounding them. Their economy isn't built for sustained warfare, and their strategy depends on pushing just far enough to create fear without triggering full retaliation. But this time, they pushed too far. And instead of creating fear, they exposed their limits. Because when faced with overwhelming, immediate, and coordinated force from the air, the sea, and below it, they didn't escalate. They stopped. And the message wasn't just for North Korea. China saw how quickly the US could mobilize massive force in the region. Russia saw how firmly alliances were enforced without hesitation. Other nations saw that threats against US allies don't stay isolated. They trigger a response that expands instantly. But there was an even more important takeaway. Deterrence isn't just about weapons. It's about credibility. And in that moment, credibility was demonstrated in real time. Not through speeches, not through warnings, but through visible, undeniable action. North Korea launched one missile to send a message. The response they received showed something far more powerful. That some lines aren't just symbolic. They're real. And crossing them comes with consequences that can't be ignored. But what made this moment unforgettable was how it all ended. The line that can't be crossed. By the time the situation fully stabilized, nothing looked like it had at the start of the day. The Hwasong-12 had already fallen harmlessly into the Pacific hours earlier. No damage, no casualties. On paper, it was just another test that ended in the ocean. But in reality, it had triggered one of the most coordinated displays of military power in the region in years. And that's what changed everything. Because the response didn't fade away after the missile landed. It didn't de-escalate immediately or disappear back into routine patrols. Instead, it left a footprint, a reminder. The USS Ronald Reagan and its strike group continued operating in the region long after the immediate threat was gone. Not in aggression, but in presence. Constant, visible, and deliberate. Jets still rotated through patrol cycles. Surveillance aircraft continued monitoring. Allied coordination stayed active. The message didn't need to be repeated. It was already understood. And inside North Korea, something shifted. Not publicly, not officially, but behavior changed. Subsequent missile tests, when they resumed, were different, more controlled, more predictable, and crucially, no longer directed over Japan. Because that single moment had drawn a line that didn't need to be spoken again. Crossing into Allied airspace was no longer treated as a statement. It was treated as a trigger, And that's the part most people miss when they look at incidents like this. It's not about the missile itself. It's about what happens after it crosses a boundary. Because once a line like that is crossed and met with overwhelming response, it stops being theoretical. It becomes understood. And understanding is what shapes behavior. For North Korea, the takeaway wasn't just about force. It was about certainty. Certainty that any future action would be met instantly, not eventually. Certainty that escalation would not remain one-sided. Certainty that allies in the region are not isolated targets, but connected lines of response. And that changes the strategy completely. Because deterrence isn't built in moments of peace. It's built in moments like this.